They thought crossing my name off a spreadsheet was the end of it. But while they were still sipping martinis on the golf course, I had already hit the button that froze their $60 million and turned their entire company to ash with nothing but an old hard drive and a cold cup of coffee. You won't be able to look away from this story. My name is Marissa Holt, and I'm 38 years old. For the past decade, I've been a senior compliance auditor at Crestfall Keen Partners, a mid-tier asset management firm nestled in the glass towers of Chicago's financial district. I used to take pride in that title, wore it like armor through the trenches of quarterly reports and regulatory filings. I thought dedication meant something in this business. I thought competence was currency. I was wrong about a lot of things. The conference room smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams that Tuesday morning in March. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the kind of persistent hum that makes you want to claw at your eardrums. I sat at the polished mahogany table, my laptop open to the quarterly compliance report I'd been perfecting for weeks. 23 pages of meticulously cross-referenced data, every number verified twice, every footnote sourced and documented. Ronald Pierce, our chief financial officer, cleared his throat from the head of the table. He was a man who wore expensive suits, like they were religious vestments, his silver hair slicked back in a style that hadn't changed since the Reagan administration. His pale blue eyes had the warmth of a winter morning in Alaska. "Marissa," he said, his voice carrying that particular blend of condescension and false sympathy that executives perfect in MBA programs. "We need to discuss some concerns about your recent work." The room went quiet. My colleagues from the accounting department shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, suddenly finding their coffee cups and smartphones far more interesting than whatever was about to unfold. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my expression neutral. In this business, showing weakness was like bleeding in shark-infested waters. "I'm sorry," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "What concerns?" Pierce slid a printed spreadsheet across the table. It was a copy of my quarterly report, but something was wrong. The numbers in column D were formatted incorrectly, showing dollar amounts without proper decimal places. What should have read as $127,450 instead appeared as $20,450. The discrepancy made it look like we were reporting figures that were off by hundreds of thousands of dollars. "This kind of carelessness is unacceptable," Pierce continued, his tone growing colder. "Our clients trust us with their financial futures. We cannot afford to have staff who treat their responsibilities so cavalierly." I stared at the paper, my mind racing. This wasn't the version I'd submitted. I'd triple-checked every cell, every formula, every formatting rule. The original report was pristine, saved on my workstation with a timestamp that would prove I'd submitted it correctly. "Ronald, there's been a mistake," I said, reaching for my laptop. The version you submitted is exactly what we received," Pierce interrupted. "I've already spoken with IT about this. The metadata confirms this came from your workstation at 4:47 p.m. yesterday." My blood turned to ice. The timestamp was right, but the content was wrong. Someone had altered my file after I'd submitted it. But how? And more importantly, why? "I think we need to carefully review this," I said, my voice gaining strength. "If there's been some kind of technical error—" "There's been no error, Marissa." Pierce's words cut through the room like a blade. "What there's been is a pattern of declining performance that we can no longer ignore. We've decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately." The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the table, feeling like I was falling down a well. 10 years of exemplary service, of staying late to catch discrepancies that could have cost the firm millions, of being the one person in this building who actually read the fine print on regulatory changes. And they were firing me over a formatting error that I didn't even make. "You can't be serious," I whispered. "Security will escort you to collect your personal items." Pierce said, already standing. HR will send you information about your final paycheck and benefits continuation. I looked around the room at my colleagues. Janet from Accounts Payable was staring at her hands. Marcus from the audit team wouldn't meet my eyes. These people had worked beside me for years, had relied on my expertise, had asked me to cover for them when they made mistakes. And now they sat in silence while I was being railroaded. That's when I realized this wasn't about a spreadsheet error. This was about something much bigger. The security guard who walked me to my desk was a kid named Tommy who'd always been polite when he checked my ID in the morning. He looked embarrassed as he followed me around, watching me pack my few personal items into a cardboard box. A coffee mug my sister had given me for my birthday. A small succulent plant that had somehow survived the fluorescent wasteland of corporate life. A framed photo of my parents from their 50th anniversary. "Sorry, Ms. Holt," Tommy mumbled as I closed my laptop bag. "This is really weird, you know. Everyone says you're like the smartest person in the building." I managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Tommy." That means a lot. What I didn't tell him was that I'd been keeping an off-site backup of all my work files for years. It was a habit I'd developed after a server crash in 2010 had nearly cost us critical audit documentation. I'd set up a small network-attached storage device in my home office, automatically syncing important files every night. It was my insurance policy against technological disasters. I never imagined it would become my weapon. My apartment was a modest one-bedroom in Lincoln Park, nothing fancy but clean and quiet. I'd chosen it primarily for the second bedroom that I'd converted into a home office. The walls were lined with financial regulations textbooks and binders full of compliance protocols. It was my sanctuary, the place where I could dig into complex problems without the constant interruptions of office life. I set the cardboard box on my kitchen counter and stared at it for a long moment. 10 years of my life reduced to a coffee mug and a dying plant. Then I walked to my office and fired up my personal laptop. The backup drive hummed to life, and I began scrolling through folders of files that dated back to my first day at Crestfall Keen. Quarterly reports, audit findings, internal memos, email chains, Slack conversations that had been automatically archived. A decade of corporate digital archaeology. I pulled up the original version of yesterday's report. There it was, exactly as I'd submitted it, with proper formatting and accurate figures. The metadata showed my last save time as 4:47 p.m., just as Pierce had said. But this version was correct. Someone had accessed my file after I'd submitted it and deliberately introduced errors. But why target me? I'd always been a team player, never made waves, never challenged the hierarchy. Tommy was the person who quietly fixed other people's mistakes and made sure the firm stayed on the right side of regulatory requirements. I was, in every sense, the perfect employee, unless perfect employees were exactly what someone didn't want around. I spent the next several hours combing through old files, looking for patterns. What I found made my blood run cold. Starting about 18 months ago, there had been a series of unusual expenditures buried in our quarterly reports. Consulting fees paid to companies I'd never heard of. Strategic advisory payments that seemed to have no corresponding documentation. Technology upgrades that appeared to exist only on paper. The amounts were significant but not outrageous. A few $100,000 here, $1 million there. The kind of numbers that would raise eyebrows if they were in a single transaction, but spread across multiple quarters and buried in different categories. They blended into the background noise of corporate spending. I created a spreadsheet and began tracking these anomalies. By 3 a.m, I had identified nearly $8 million in questionable expenditures over the past year and a half. All of them had been approved by Ronald Pierce. The coffee in my mug had gone cold hours ago, but I barely noticed. I was deep in the zone, following a trail of financial breadcrumbs that led to increasingly disturbing conclusions. many of the consulting companies receiving these payments had no online presence beyond basic incorporation filings. No websites, no employee directories, no business addresses that weren't just mail forwarding services. One name kept appearing: Melrose Strategies, LLC. They'd received payments totaling $2.3 million over the past 8 months for strategic market analysis and competitive intelligence gathering. But when I searched for any evidence of their actual work, I found nothing. No reports, no presentations, no email correspondence about their findings. That's when I remembered the company holiday party last December. Pierce had been holding court near the bar, telling stories about his college days at Northwestern. He'd mentioned a fraternity brother named Dave Melrose who'd gone into business consulting. Smart guy, Pierce had said, really understands how to position assets for maximum return. I felt sick. This wasn't just financial irregularities. This was a systematic embezzlement scheme, and I'd been fired because my attention to detail was getting too close to exposing it. I spent the rest of the night documenting everything. I created a master spreadsheet that tracked every suspicious payment, cross-referenced with approval timestamps, and supporting documentation. I pulled email chains where Pierce had subtly discouraged deeper investigation into certain expenditures. I found Slack messages where he'd steered conversations away from budget discrepancies. By dawn, I had built a comprehensive case that would make any prosecutor's mouth water. The evidence was overwhelming, detailed, and damning. But I also knew that going to the authorities immediately would be a mistake. Pierce had spent months covering his tracks, and he'd fire me to prevent me from uncovering more. He'd be expecting me to cause trouble, which meant I needed to be smarter than he was. I called in sick to my temp agency job that I'd lined up for later that week. Instead, I spent the day researching whistleblower protections and financial crime reporting procedures. I learned about the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower, which offers both legal protection and monetary rewards for reporting securities violations. I read about the Dodd-Frank Act's anti-retaliation provisions. I studied case law about wrongful termination in the context of compliance violations. Most importantly, I reached out to Laura Haskins, my old roommate from college, who'd gone on to become a federal prosecutor specializing in white-collar crime. She'd left the U.S. Attorney's Office the previous year to join a private firm that represented whistleblowers, and she'd been trying to get me to meet up for coffee for months. "Marissa," Laura's voice was warm with surprise when I called. "I was just thinking about you. How are things at the finance factory?" "Not great," I said. "Laura, I need to ask you something hypothetically. If someone discovered evidence of embezzlement at their company and they were fired right before they could report it, what would be the best way to proceed?" There was a pause. "That's a very specific hypothetical," Laura said carefully. "Are we talking about a friend of yours?" "We're talking about me." Another pause, longer this time. "How much money are we talking about?" "At least $8 million that I can prove so far." "Possibly more." "Jesus, Marissa, can you be in my office in an hour?" Laura's law firm occupied 2 floors of a sleek building in the Loop. Her office had floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the Chicago River, and I found myself momentarily distracted by the view of boats moving lazily through the water. It seemed impossibly peaceful compared to the storm that was brewing in my head. "Tell me everything," Laura said, settling into her chair across from me. She'd changed since college, trading her punk rock aesthetic for sharp business suits, but her green eyes still had the same intensity that had made her such a formidable debate partner in our constitutional law class. I walked her through everything I'd discovered, showing her the documentation I'd compiled. She took notes in a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific transactions or approval processes. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and whistled softly. "This is good work, Marissa. Really good work. You've essentially built the prosecution's case for them. So what do I do now?" We need to be strategic about this. The timing of your termination is actually beneficial from a legal standpoint. It establishes clear retaliation for your compliance work, but we need to protect you and preserve the evidence. She outlined a plan that was both elegant and ruthless. First, I would compile everything into a comprehensive evidence package, with multiple copies stored in different locations. Second, we would establish a dead man switch. If anything happened to me, or if I failed to check in with Laura every 48 hours, the evidence would automatically be transmitted to the SEC, the FBI, and several financial journalists. The key is to make sure Pierce knows he can't just make this go away by making you go away, Laura explained. Once he realizes you have the evidence and it's protected, he'll be forced to focus on damage control rather than witness elimination. You really think he'd try to hurt me? Laura's expression grew serious. Marissa, we're talking about someone who's stolen millions of dollars and has already demonstrated he's willing to destroy careers to protect himself. I don't want to scare you, but you need to take precautions. That evening, I went to work implementing our plan. I created encrypted copies of all the evidence, storing them on multiple cloud services and physical drives. I compiled a detailed timeline of events, complete with supporting documentation. I wrote a comprehensive statement explaining how I'd discovered the fraud and why I believed I'd been fired to prevent its exposure. Then I did something that surprised even me. I accessed the firm's financial systems, using the credentials I technically still had for another few hours before they were deactivated. I didn't alter anything or steal information. I simply placed a temporary hold on several large wire transfers that were scheduled to go out the next day. The transfers totaled just over $60 million, destined for various offshore accounts, that I'd traced to shell companies with ties to Pierce's network. By placing the holds, I wasn't stealing anything. I was just temporarily preventing money from leaving the firm's accounts until the holds could be reviewed and approved by additional signatories. In the banking world, this is called a compliance hold. It's a standard procedure used to prevent potentially fraudulent transfers. As a senior compliance officer, I had the authority to place such holds, and my termination wouldn't be effective until the end of the business day. Technically, it was completely legal. Practically, it was going to cause Pierce a massive heart attack. I went to bed that night feeling a strange mixture of terror and satisfaction. I'd just declared war on one of Chicago's most prestigious financial firms, and I'd done it with nothing but a laptop and a decade of accumulated knowledge about how money moves through the system. My phone started ringing at 6:30 a.m. Marissa? It was Janet from Accounts Payable, her voice tight with stress. Are you okay? There's some kind of problem with the wire transfers, and Mr. Pierce is going absolutely insane. He's demanding to know if you did something to the system. I'm fine, Janet, and I didn't do anything to the system. I just exercised my authority as a compliance officer to place holds on some transactions that look suspicious. You can't do that. You don't work here anymore. Actually, I do work there for another 10 hours. My termination doesn't take effect until end of business yesterday, and the holds were placed before that deadline. There was a long pause. Marissa, what's going on? This isn't like you. What's going on is that someone has been stealing from the firm for over a year, and they fired me to keep me from exposing it. The holds I placed are on wire transfers to companies that don't exist, funneling money to offshore accounts. If Pierce is upset about it, maybe he should explain why the firm is trying to send $60 million to shell companies. I hung up before Janet could respond. Within minutes, my phone was buzzing with calls from other numbers at the firm. I ignored them all. By noon, the story had broken. Asset management firm faces federal investigation after whistleblower allegations, read the headline in the Chicago Tribune's online edition. The article was brief but devastating. It mentioned allegations of embezzlement, questionable overseas transfers, and a compliance officer who'd been terminated immediately before the irregularities came to light. The reporter hadn't mentioned my name, but anyone at Crestfall Keen would know exactly who the whistleblower was. Laura had been busy that morning, feeding carefully selected information to her contacts in the financial press. The goal wasn't to try the case in the media, but to make sure Pierce couldn't claim the allegations were a surprise that required time to investigate. My phone rang again. This time it was a number I didn't recognize. Ms. Holt, this is Agent Jennifer Morrison with the FBI's white-collar crime unit. I understand you have information about possible securities fraud at Crestfall Keen Partners. Would you be available to meet with us this afternoon? Yes, I said. I'll be there. The FBI field office in Chicago was nothing like the sleek corporate towers I was used to. It was all government-issued furniture and fluorescent lighting, with the kind of institutional decor that suggested function over form. Agent Morrison was a compact woman in her 40s with prematurely grey hair and eyes that missed nothing. You've built quite a case here, she said, flipping through the evidence package I'd prepared. This is some of the most thorough documentation I've seen in a fraud investigation. I spent 10 years learning how to track money, I replied. I know how these systems work. Tell me about the wire transfers you blocked. I explained the compliance holds I'd placed, walking her through the legal authority I'd used and the suspicious nature of the destination accounts. Agent Morrison took detailed notes, occasionally asking follow-up questions about specific transactions or approval processes. You realize this is going to get very messy, she said when I finished. Pierce isn't going to go quietly. He's going to claim you're a disgruntled employee who fabricated evidence to get revenge for being fired. Let him try. Every piece of evidence I've provided can be independently verified. The metadata on the files, the bank records, the email chains, it's all there. What about the timing? The fact that you discovered all this evidence immediately after being terminated? I'd been expecting this question. Agent Morrison, I'd been noticing irregularities for months, but every time I tried to dig deeper, Pierce would redirect my attention to other priorities. He was very skilled at keeping me busy with urgent but ultimately meaningless tasks. It wasn't until I had uninterrupted time to analyze the patterns that I realized what was happening. And you never suspected anything before? I suspected something was off, but I didn't know what. Pierce was careful. He spread the fraudulent transactions across multiple quarters and different budget categories. He never took so much that it would trigger automatic alerts. If I hadn't been fired and given the time to do a comprehensive analysis, I might never have put it all together. Agent Morrison closed the folder. We'll need you to provide additional documentation as we proceed with the investigation. Are you prepared for that? I'm prepared for whatever it takes. The investigation moved quickly. Within a week, federal agents had raided Crestfall Keen's offices, seizing computers and financial records. The firm's assets were frozen pending a full audit. Several employees were placed on administrative leave while investigators sorted through the evidence. Pierce hired one of Chicago's most expensive defense attorneys, a man named Hartwell, who specialized in white-collar crime. He immediately went on the offensive, claiming that I was an unstable employee who'd fabricated evidence to get revenge for being terminated. Ms. Holt had access to the firm's computer systems for years, Hartwell told reporters. She had both the technical skills and the motivation to manipulate financial records after she was fired. The timing of these allegations is highly suspicious. But Laura had anticipated this strategy. She'd advised me to preserve every piece of evidence with proper timestamps and metadata, making it impossible for Pierce's team to claim I'd fabricated anything. Moreover, the wire transfers I'd blocked were real, and the shell companies receiving them were exactly what they appeared to be. Fronts for money laundering. The media coverage was relentless. Financial journalists love a good fraud story, especially one involving a respected firm and a whistleblower who'd been fired for doing their job. The Chicago Tribune ran a series of articles detailing the scope of the alleged embezzlement. The Wall Street Journal published a feature about the role of compliance officers in detecting financial crimes. Bloomberg ran a profile of me that painted me as a dedicated public servant who'd sacrificed her career to expose corporate corruption. Pierce's attorney tried to control the narrative, but the evidence was overwhelming. Bank records confirmed the suspicious transfers. Email chains showed Pierce discouraging deeper investigation into questionable expenditures. Most damaging of all, investigators discovered that several of the shell companies receiving payments were owned by Pierce's college fraternity brothers, including Dave Melrose. The house of cards began to collapse. 3 weeks after the FBI raid, Pierce was arrested at his home in Winnetka. The charges included wire fraud, securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. The indictment detailed a scheme that had stolen nearly $12 million from client accounts over 18 months. But Pierce wasn't the only one facing charges. The investigation had uncovered a broader network of conspirators, including several employees who'd helped facilitate the fraudulent transactions. Marcus from the audit team, who'd refused to meet my eyes during that final meeting, was arrested for his role in approving fake invoices. Even Janet from accounts payable was charged with conspiracy for processing payments she should have known were suspicious. The firm itself was finished. Client funds were transferred to other management companies, and Crestfall Keen Partners was dissolved. The building that had housed the company for 23 years was sold to pay creditors and victim restitution. I testified before a federal grand jury, walking them through the evidence I'd compiled and explaining how the fraud had been concealed. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Diana Chen, told me afterward that my documentation had made their case airtight. Without your work, we might have been able to prove some of the individual transactions were fraudulent, but we wouldn't have been able to demonstrate the scope and sophistication of the scheme, she said. You didn't just hand us evidence, you handed us a complete prosecution roadmap. The trial lasted 6 weeks. I spent 3 days on the witness stand, explaining the technical aspects of the fraud and walking the jury through the evidence I'd discovered. Pierce's attorney tried to discredit me, suggesting I was motivated by revenge and had manipulated the evidence. But the numbers didn't lie. The bank records didn't lie. The email chains didn't lie. And most importantly, the fact that I'd been fired immediately before the fraud was exposed didn't lie. Pierce was convicted on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the victims. His co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 2 to 8 years, depending on their level of involvement. I received a whistleblower award from the SEC, totaling $18 million, 10% of the money that was recovered through the investigation. It was more money than I'd ever dreamed of having, but it came with a price. My name was now permanently associated with one of the biggest financial fraud cases in Chicago history. Some people called me a hero. Others called me a traitor who'd destroyed a respected firm and cost dozens of people their jobs. I tried not to pay attention to either characterization. I'd simply done what I'd been trained to do, follow the numbers and report what I found. 6 months after the trial ended, I bought a small house in a quiet suburb outside the city. I started a consulting practice, helping other companies strengthen their compliance programs and detect potential fraud. The work was satisfying in a way that my corporate job had never been. I was using my skills to prevent the kind of corruption that had destroyed Crestfall Keen. But I never forgot the lesson I'd learned from that experience. In the world of corporate finance, competence and integrity aren't always valued. Sometimes they're seen as threats to be eliminated. And sometimes the only way to protect yourself is to be willing to burn down the entire system that's trying to destroy you. I kept the old backup drive in my desk drawer, a reminder of how a single spreadsheet error, one that I didn't even make, had led to the exposure of a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. It was a testament to the power of careful documentation and the importance of always keeping your own copies of important files. People often ask me if I regret what I did. They want to know if I feel guilty about destroying a company and sending people to prison. The answer is complicated. I regret that Pierce and his conspirators chose to steal from their clients. I regret that they created a culture where honest employees were seen as threats. I regret that they forced me to choose between my career and my conscience. But I don't regret exposing the truth. I don't regret standing up for the investors who trusted their money to professionals who betrayed that trust. And I don't regret proving that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption is simply refusing to look the other way. The coffee mug from that final day at Crestfall. Keene sits on my desk now, holding pens and paper clips. It's a reminder that even the smallest details matter in the world of finance, and that sometimes the people who pay attention to those details are the only thing standing between order and chaos. They fired me over a spreadsheet. They thought it was the end of my story. Instead, it was just the beginning.